Hello?
Hello, Professor McElduff.
Yes. Sorry about that. I don't know, my speakers on my laptop seem to be having issues, so
No,
it wasn't
not
picking
a
up.
problem. Yeah, not a problem at all. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this. I know there's probably better things that you can be doing on a Friday night, although it does sound like we saved you from at least a little bit of drudgery, uh,
Yes,
if
I
you're still
have.
doing.
You're the way I'm putting off going cleaning because I've got a bunch of people coming over tomorrow. So, so it's either, so not that I am not delighted to talk to you, but it is either you or clean the fridge out.
Yeah,
So,
well, I'm glad that we rate at least higher than cleaning out the fridge. But I was going to say
there
too,
you
I'm
go.
sure.
High praise indeed.
Yeah, I'm sure you can also tell an interesting story about how you told a bunch of video game nerds about Ancient Spectacle over the internet. So we're getting a few people filing in right. We have a few people filing in right now. I failed to introduce you properly though. Would you mind if I just took a second to let people know who you are and what you study before we begin talking?
No, of course. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. The person I'm speaking with right now is Professor McElduff from the UBC Department of Classical, Near Eastern, and Religious Studies. I did do a little bit of background reading in addition to the material I got through the email, which was I found that in addition to ancient spectacle, which is mostly what we're going to be talking about today, she generally studies Roman culture. She also deals with a figure that I found very interesting when I was doing my own studies, Cicero, which means that she's well studied in rhetoric, and I'm sure we'll get a chance to see that on display in our talk today, and has also won the Killiam Teaching Award, which I've had to write a couple of recommendation letters for, and so I know both how hard that is to get and what kind of teaching that means. So for everybody who's tuning in, we're certainly very lucky to have her with us, and I think it's a chance to maybe get a bit of a view in terms of what these animated figures on the screen look like. So probably not the best introduction I could have given, but I think
No,
that
it's
more or less.
incredibly generous, and now I am just wondering how I possibly live up to
Well, let's
that.
see.
Oh,
Well, if it, I've not polled anybody, but I think if it helps, not everybody who's tuned in is, well, I mean, some people aren't even at the point where they're going to university yet. So I think any chance for us to engage with these ideas a little bit deeper will meet our expectations. But I certainly, having been in Professor Griffin's classes, I've come to know that the classics professors are both very modest, but also extremely gifted in terms of their instruction.
oh, that's very nice. I will repeat that to Michael from you as well, if you don't mind.
No, not at all. I actually still owe him some essays for a project that he was
Oh,
doing. So,
so if I see
but
him on Monday, I'll be sure to say that, just in case. If so, and get them in right afterwards. Sort of time it well. We could probably work this out.
excellent.
So
And
yeah, so I don't know if you want me just to start or
I think that would be best. I will admit this is as some context. I know Michael sent out an email, but this is somewhat of a thank you, but also an effort to get some extra donations to a fundraiser that we did for the BC Children's Hospital. We're actually close to
Mhm.
raising $500 now, so it's just a chance to get a
Wow.
couple of people who are on the fence to to get us past that milestone. But one thing that happened was a lot of people were really engaged in some of the ideas behind this game, in terms of the history and that. And so, I certainly have a few ideas in terms of things that, I'd like to know more about because I'm not a classics student. I just got a chance to
Mhm.
take a couple of classes. But I think maybe the best way to go would be for you to talk about what you think is interesting on this, and maybe what's worth knowing, or maybe what some assumptions people might have that aren't necessarily justified.
Okay. Well, so just I have to give you like a 60 second sort of Roman history lesson because we're going to talk mainly about Roman spectacles, which is generally what people think about because you think about the Colosseum.
Of
And the
course.
only thing you really need to remember is that Rome started off as a republic, which meant that people had to run for election. That collapsed because people were so hyper competitive, they were literally killing each other to hold high political office and bankrupting themselves and their families to put on spectacles so they could get votes. Then you get the Emperor Augustus, who comes in say this is in 31 CE or AD, BCE. So, and after Antony and Cleopatra commit suicide, which people might know about, sort of Rome flips and becomes an empire. And the emperor has to use the games as the way to reach the most amount of people. In an age before, you could reach people like this, or even with television, the best way to talk to the maximum number of people was through spectacle, to put on a big show and address them and have people carrying around placards sort of with your words on it, so then they could cheer even if they couldn't hear. So for that, basically, you would bankrupt the empire. This is basically a major sort of expense that the Romans, they don't pay for anything else. They don't have social security. They don't have any of those other things, but they have money for spectacles in the army. So those are the two components that sort of support the empire. So in terms of that, okay, I'm going to just say, I think the biggest misconception that most people have is that the spectacle that everybody wanted to see was gladiators. And I strongly suspect that's true, especially if you've seen the Spartacus series. Has anybody seen the Spartacus series there? I don't know. Have you?
I am aware of it. I haven't actually. I've seen the Stanley Kubrick film, but I know that's not at all related to what
There's a hell of a lot more nudity and sort of murder in the in the TV series. It bears the only relationship. Well, to be honest, basically whatever I say about that series, I'm pretty sure Spartacus wore more clothing because he would have frozen to death if he didn't. But it's pretty much. But most people think about that, and that's not true. Most people also think that gladiators generally died in the arena, and that's also not true. It's probably, pound for pound, not that much deadlier than, a lot of sort of professional sports where, especially before people have protective equipment. So just to sort of talk about the most popular spectacle in ancient Rome was chariot racing. And basically, that's because it was both very exciting. You ran 7 laps with, 2 or 4 chariots with 2 or 4 horses. There were teams, and there weren't teams for gladiators. And nothing gets people more excited than teams. So there was the red, the greens, the whites, and the blues. And so there were these 4 factions, and these 4 teams, if you can imagine it, were the same 4 teams all the way across the empire. So wherever you were, it's like sort of being a Vancouver Canuck, or the original 6. Say every city in North America had the original 6 again in some version. So you could go from city to city still supporting the same team without ever having to change.
Right, so if you were a team blue player, it didn't matter wherever you were going, there would always be the equivalent of the Canucks for you, is what you're saying.
Yes, there would always be the Blues, and, at some point it became so ridiculously prevalent that, they sort of divided whole cities. Basically it ended up with just with just 2 of the factions, and so basically fire brigades, everything was organized according to what team you supported. And there was...
Sorry, just so I can clarify on that, when you say fire, so you're talking about so kind of public services would be organized around what team you supported?
Yes, you lived in a blue. Yeah, you lived in a blue neighborhood. You had a blue fire brigade. You went to sort of the blue sort of temple of Venus.
That's. I was going to say.
Entire life.
Yeah, I certainly know some Canucks fans who might fall under that level of commitment, but that's surprising, and I mean that's exactly the kind of stuff that I was hoping to get out of a talk like this, because certainly the first thing I think of is the Ridley Scott movie in terms of Roman spectacle, and I had a sneaking suspicion. Yeah. And I was going to say too, one thing that really fascinated me that I always sort of suspected might have been true, but I never had any evidence to think otherwise. When you have this idea of how, we have this perception of gladiator games being very deadly, but I also know that there seemed to be at least, the popular conception is that there were popular gladiators, and I'm assuming that if there's a high mortality rate, you can't really get a lot of star power before somebody ceases to compete, let's say. So that's another thing that was, I guess. Again, an assumption that you get from media. Yeah. Sorry, please go ahead.
The death rate for gladiators. So somebody went and did a very, very tedious job of looking at all the tombstones and sort of looking at all the records and sort of trying to sort of count up and do some sort of analysis about how many gladiators we could say would die in the arena. and it's about 10%.
Hmm.
So it's not without risk. However, that 10% is heavily weighted in favor of people who are first time in the arena. So the less experience you have, the more likely you're to get killed, because you're also fighting against somebody who's less experienced, and they don't actually really want to kill people because it's incredibly expensive to pay for a dead gladiator. Like, you can hire them but if one of them gets killed, it's 20%, it's 20 times the hiring price. So, like, just for an economic reason. And then the other thing is, people don't want to lose experienced gladiators, and then people don't want to vote for the death of gladiators whom they've seen before. So the more times you've been in the arena, the more chance that you will not die. And then there's the whole thing about, like, just fighting two inexperienced swords people fighting against each other. You can kill somebody without really planning on it. So so basically you would fight. So this is the other thing is, and people just think, like, you go out and you fight and there's no rules. There's a referee out there, which nobody ever mentions. So there's somebody out there whose job it is to make certain you don't do anything illegal. We have no idea what was illegal or not. Like, we don't really know very much about, like, how they fought. So there's somebody out there, and basically, and his other job is to make certain you keep fighting, like, that you don't seem to have a pact. So you go out there, you're matched against somebody who's of equal rank to you. So they don't match you against somebody who's much better or much worse, because it's really boring for people to watch. People don't want to watch people just be killed. They can go to the executions for that. What they want is skill. So it's sort of like ultimate, I guess, the ultimate fighting. I think that's probably the closest equivalent to it. So it's
Right.
brutal, it's vicious, but there are no rounds, so you don't just stop and you just fight. And you probably just fight for about 20 minutes, because that's about as much time as you can fight somewhere hot.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say too, I know the dictates of Hollywood will certainly say that you want to get as much of your
Yeah.
stunt budget as you can, but I haven't practiced much in terms of the martial arts, but I certainly know that it takes a lot out of you. Even now, again, I'm one of those first and only time gladiatorial combatants. I am not going to last in the arena more than once.
No,
But
you
even with
never
that in
know.
mind, it's exhausting.
They train you up. I mean, the other thing is, why you don't want people killed is because it's an immense expense, both for you and the person who's put them in the arena. Like, if I've been training you since you were 8 and you go out at 16 and die, I make no more money from you.
Hmm.
Whereas if you keep lasting, I will make a percentage of your winnings. And that's the other thing is, even slave gladiators basically were more, not legally, but had generally an agreement that they kept like something like 20% of their winnings.
Right.
So
Actually,
it isn't just like free for all.
Mhm. This raises an interesting question
Pardon?
too. When you're talking about slave gladiators and also training,
Mm-hmm.
is the matter of becoming a gladiator, is that a matter of choice for people? Is that a profession that somebody would want to go into, or is it something that's sort of decided for you?
It's a mix of all three. Like, so you can actually get condemned to the gladiatorial school. So, instead of, say, being condemned to the mines or something, they can send you off to the gladiatorial school. It's particularly humiliating because it's usually a step downwards, like socially. You lose a lot of your social rights, even if you aren't going to die necessarily. Um, there are slaves, so the original gladiators would have been prisoners of war. So you may take prisoners of war. You may just buy people, children, and just train them. And that goes for men and women. Like, there are female gladiators too. We can go back to that. So it's a mix of both. And so some of them are slaves. Some people volunteer, and the people who volunteer are quite popular, but die at an extremely high rate. So there are
I
people
get,
like you.
sorry, please go
Pardon?
ahead.
No, it's sort of
Oh,
like one of those things. It seems to have been a thrill seeker thing, but just because you want to climb Mount Everest doesn't mean you should.
yeah, I was gonna say, like, that strikes me as a sort of thing where, you get very excited by what you'll see in the Colosseum or wherever these are viewed. I'm assuming that it's more than just the Colosseum where they were seen. But
Hmm.
again, everybody wants to be a rock star, but there's not enough positions for, like, I mean, there's only so many talented rock stars, and the rest of them probably would better not pick, but would be better not to pick up instruments, which I'm sort of assuming is a little bit, as you say, with the high mortality rate of gladiators by
Yeah.
choice.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, I think the other point about that is worth remembering is that gladiators don't seem to like other gladiators who fight like sort of what's his face in Gladiator, Maximus,
Oh
because they're
yes,
wankers.
yeah.
Yes, because there's a set of rules. I'm sorry about the language, but there's a set of rules, just as there is in any sort of event. Like the guy who doesn't play by the rules, nobody wants to watch that because you haven't showed up. It's like, if you showed up for hockey and they decided to play rugby, well, maybe more people would be wounded in that, especially if it were on ice. But it isn't what you paid your money for. So you're going to be really angry. So basically, they want the ritual. They want the people like facing off. They want all of the. It seems to be very much a thing. And so there's a lot of stuff in the ancient sources that when people make people fight contrary to the rules, the audience doesn't like it.
Mm. That's kind of
So
interesting,
the other
especially.
thing is, sorry.
I'm sorry. Well, I was just going to say, that's actually also a very stark contrast to, again, I have to keep coming back to the Academy
Mm-hmm.
Award-winning film just because it's really the
Yeah.
most popular idea of it. But I mean, that's the exact opposite from how they portray it, which is that he's, a military man who's very efficient at ending lives, which isn't the reason he's
Yeah.
popular. And once he becomes this very, supercharged kind of entertainer is where, win the crowd, win your freedom and all that. But what you're saying is, I think you do this very wonderful job of sort of grounding it in modern situations, which is to say that, just think about if this happened in one of your favorite sports where, you know, you didn't pay for it, you don't enjoy it. I think that's a really nice way of putting it. It's something I'd never really thought of before.
Yeah, and it's a significant investment of your time. So, because quite frequently, so there's a difference. So, gladiatorial shows go on in the evening. So, you have in the morning, you have beast hunts. So, and then you have the lunchtime show is executions, and that's really not very popular because it's really boring. You're just watching people, and so they often have spectacular executions. And so in the afternoon, it's the gladiators because those are the most expensive portion, and it's sort of so basically, sort of, they're sort of part of a package deal. So, and the fact that people are often opting not to go to the executions, they're going home for lunch or, going to the bathroom, doing the thing that everybody does, and when they've got an hour in between these things, suggests that really, although the Romans had no problem with people being executed publicly, it wasn't just very interesting to watch for them.
Mm.
So, and the thing that you mentioned, I think the thing is that, I mean, I love Gladiator. I think it's a great film. I have no problem with Gladiator. I think it gets a lot of things right about the Romans too. But I think the
Mm.
thing that always disappoints me about Gladiator is that it's not ambitious enough because the thing when people talk about spectacles, if you move outside the gladiators, that's where you get to the really enormous spectacles. So the Romans would stage battles in the Circus Maximus. They would stage sea fights. One time, a sea fight with 19,000 people. So they would flood. Originally, when the Colosseum was built, it didn't have the sort of structures below, so you could flood it. So they would flood the Colosseum. You can't get a very good sea fight because there'd only be little tiny ships in the Colosseum. But they had a whole
Right.
purpose-built lake. So they had a purpose-built lake where you could have these things. And the 19,000 people thing was an event thrown by the Emperor Claudius to get people to go out and see some public works.
That's incredible. I was going to say too, I'd heard about that sort of thing in, let's say, in France, I think they talked a little bit about things like that on a smaller scale. I have to suspect that probably
Mm-hmm.
this is the idea of a lot of very powerful rulers in Europe sort of wanting to recapture some of what Rome had in this idea here. But I'd never actually heard of the sea fights, and I mean, that would make for absolutely wonderful cinema. That seems like a tremendous missed opportunity, as you said.
I think so too. Like, I mean, I think if you get like people, because people are using way more people, like, so they're using thousands of people, like, they're staging major like battles, like, just for people to see in the middle of Rome. Caesar, like, say, so Julius Caesar was the first person to put on one of these sea fights, and apparently the crush was so big in Rome that a couple of senators got trampled to death. So that's how it's, that's how it's phrased. Like, and then it sort of wanders off the source wanders off talking about other things. So it's a big deal. So I mean, I feel like that's the bit where you're like, Well, the spectacle, the really lavish sort of way that we imagine it, doesn't necessarily overlap into gladiators because that's not, you go to gladiators to see somebody use a sword nicely, a good bit of shield
Mhm.
work, some fancy footwork, and it probably was a lot more like professional wrestling than
Mhm.
we imagine.
Yeah.
Because the other thing you have to remember is in the Colosseum, you were probably hardly seeing anything unless the guys were like really exaggerating all their movements.
Hmm. And that's
So,
actually one of my other nerdy occupations actually is I don't know if you've seen this institution, but downtown there's a place called Academy Duello, which does
oh
sword
yes,
play.
I so want to take a class with them. I can't believe that somebody's going to actually teach me how to sword fight.
It's really interesting because the very first thing that you learn is there's a great economy in much of the movement if you are trying to, if you're trying to win a bout. But
Mm.
I've sadly never been to the Colosseum myself, but I've seen photos, and certainly if you were to do what is effective, the back row seats probably can't be that entertaining for you. So I think what you're suggesting here is that there's a certain degree of pageantry that's going on the part of the fighters, that they're not necessarily fighting the way that they
Yes.
would if they were in a battle. Yeah.
Yes, and so the thing is, the training overlaps. Now that's the one thing. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like not dangerous or like not too bad, because obviously people like died and like died at 15 or young ages because that's the age these people were going into the arena. So there is a sort of pageantry. However, these people were serious fighters. I mean, because we know this because they use them every once in a while to train Roman soldiers. So
Okay.
clearly their skills were effective and were felt to be effective in one-on-one combat, but I sort of think that it was a display,
Mhm.
maybe that especially in big arenas, like anything more than 20,000 people, it has to have gone like that. Otherwise, a big chunk of your audience is not really going to get anything.
Right. Um,
So.
and on a this is a little bit off of the topic, and you raised this interesting idea. This is actually one thing I'd seen from your website when I was doing my homework. But one thing I did want to,
For you.
yeah, with the but before we go into Women Gladiators, which is probably the big I don't know, the big reveal in this broadcast. I think one of the questions that I did have, both from your introduction and in terms of talk of the investment in that, and actually this does relate to the Ridley Scott film, so maybe one of the ways I can phrase this question is to begin with. Apparently, there was a scene in the script which they decided not to film because they didn't think anybody would find it that credible, where Maximus is put up on, a poster or basically is given a sponsorship for a particular oil company or that. Is this actually something that happened? Were there such sponsorships, or is this make believe?
I mean, I find it hard to believe that there weren't. I mean, to be honest, like one thing is you've got to remember is that this is the sort of ephemera. Like we know so little about gladiators. I mean, we know quite a lot from Pompeii. Like we know that people advertised the shows and they'd say, "Oh, so and so's coming from this school." So clearly people followed like certain schools. And we, have sexy sort of like I don't know. Remember, was one thing saying, so and so the Thracian makes all the girls sigh. Though we don't know if he might have written it, So definitely, somebody pointed that out for ages. Like they were going on, and they're like, yeah, but it's in the barracks, so it could have been a girl. It could have just been some lonely gladiator, sort of pimping himself up a bit. But so it's really hard to say. So we don't know very much. We do know there were programs, so you could go and get programs for gladiatorial shows. So you went in knowing who was fighting. And I do like to imagine like some enterprising tavern owner was like, getting slaves to copy out, come down to sort of Claudius's, with this 10% off or something. And we also know, there was a huge amount of commerce around, obviously, the Colosseum, around all these arenas. People were selling stuff. And the other thing I find it really important to point out, because nobody ever thinks about this, is there were loos in the Colosseum. People weren't holding it for 4 hours. So, like, I feel like this is the sort of crucial thing because people always imagine this. And I'm like, Sarah, like, I had this conversation once. I was like, no, you have to have had bathrooms. Like, you had snack cellars and everything. All of this was provided for. They weren't always inside the actual buildings, but there's a fresco from Pompeii, and you can see the outdoor loos, the sort of equivalent of those porta potties outside the arena.
That's that's
So
a
yeah, so I feel that's really critical. I don't know why, but like I feel like it's like one of those sort of practical things that people should know about the ancient world. They did go to the bathroom.
yeah.
So
You don't, yeah, I was gonna say it's, I guess because there's no marble bust of somebody going to the bathroom that nobody ever thinks about
yeah.
that in the classical world. That's a medieval invention. Um,
Yes, before that we were all somehow like the human race was just much more efficient.
now this actually moves into it's sort of the sponsorship question was going to go to a slightly I guess a broader or maybe a
hmm
more complicated question was when you started this talk you sort of talked about the switch from the Republic to the Empire, and it's actually quite appropriate because
hmm
the I am playing as Rome in the game right now, and
Uh-huh.
it is Augustus that you have to play in this game. But I think what interested me was you talked about
Oh,
spectacle.
sorry,
Oh,
sorry,
sorry.
sorry. Sorry, that's just me protesting at that being your only choice of a Roman.
Yeah, yeah. I agree. Although I will say, for in the game's defense, I think its choice of forcing you into particular characters has actually resulted in me learning some interesting history. For instance, I never
All
knew
right.
about a woman Chinese empress, save for the fact that your only choice of a Chinese ruler is Wu Zhaitan.
Okay.
So it does have a nice educational purpose. Although I agree that from what I've read, there are certainly many more well, maybe not more interesting Romans because I do find Augustus interesting, but
No, no, I'm just never. I'm just something around. I never let. If you take a class with Professor Bablitz, never let her know I said that because she's very much an Augustus fan, but I'm a Cicero person, so.
yes, of course.
So
Um,
anyway, moving on from sort of pointless sort of classic trivia.
oh yeah, yeah. But the one question I had meant to ask you when you talked kind of about the again bankrupting the empire, bankrupting families' houses, staging these spectacles, and I know we focused a lot on gladiators. I apologize for that, but I think
No,
what interests me, one thing that interests me here is, do you feel that this form of entertainment would have, I don't know, survived or thrived on its own without this? I mean, obviously, it's a tool that seems to be used by the state, or at least people who have sort of a vested interest in terms of getting their message out, as you pointed out. Is this a sort of thing that would be propped up by the state, or is this something that had enough of an economy around it that even if it wasn't such a useful tool, it would have been something that would have continued on, on its own.
I mean, I think it's one thing for one. I mean, I think one thing it's important to remember is that the state doesn't have it all its own way. One of the good thing about sort of spectacles is that even now, if you think about it, the only time on a regular basis you see, say, 16,000 people being allowed to gather or more gather downtown without needing a permit is for a sports event.
Okay.
So sports events, particularly for individuals who are powerless, I mean, they can be used against you, but they can also give you a powerful voice. And people use the arena and the Circus Maximus to protest because there were so many of them. You know, there's 50 to 60,000 in the Colosseum, a quarter of a million in the Circus Maximus. You know, you can't kill a quarter of a million people. So it doesn't, and it also becomes a way that you can show defiance to the emperor too. Like they also have plays and things like this, and so there's going to be ways that this can be used, and so it isn't just the emperor or rich people using it to sort of concede to people. And the other thing is, I'm not always sure that people got very good value for money. Like I feel like it's a bit like modern sports. You spend a lot of money on it because it's a thing that you've always done, and in the ancient world because it was tied in with ancient religion. So chariot racing took part as part of religious events. Expending all of this energy on the behalf of the gods was thought to be pleasing to the gods. So chariot racing was a religious occurrence as well as like a spectacle. Like it didn't stop you betting on the horses, but it was still a religious event in a way that I guess we don't combine that sort of thing anymore. Like we don't really have that sort of, we don't approach religion in the same way in general
Yeah, the best
any
I guess we
longer.
have is somebody, says a prayer on a touchdown, but that's not quite the same as that's not the motivation for the act, let's say.
Yeah, so we don't put on the Super Bowl to appease, sort of some sort of angry deity, who must have the Super Bowl every year. Otherwise, for example, so there was a feast of Consus, which is so this is a Roman god, and his altar, he's a very important god that nobody's ever heard of until you sort of talk about him. So his altar was buried in the Circus Maximus, and so every time it was his festival, which was related to horses, you would uncover it, and all the horses and donkeys, except for the chariot racing, sort of the chariot teams, got to take the day off. Consus was the Roman god of storage. So it's not always the gods you'd imagine.
Yeah.
I mean, in fairness, storage is very important for sort of pre-modern societies. Like if you store grain, so he's specifically the god of grain storage. So he's the god who protects your grain when you store it, which is very important, of course. But
yeah, I was actually going to say this is the one thing that always interests me about these kinds of talks, which is that it's always, it's always cute to kind of look at these sorts of things and just say, oh, weren't we so crazy back then? But there's very few times that I've heard a practice that didn't have some utility behind it. I mean, as you point out, storage is extremely important when you consider the fact that you don't have refrigerators for a very long time. Certainly past the time, we're kind of done with gods by the time we finally come around to refrigerators. Things like that. I was going to say, those are always kind of nice to, I guess for lack of a better term, they're almost little reality checks because it's always, it always strikes me as something that, whenever people talk about the world being, so-and-so thinking the world being flat, it's not that people didn't have reasons for doing what they did. It's just sometimes it's a little bit easier to make fun of things than think about them at a deeper level.
Yeah, there's a cultural logic to a lot of these things. And, societies on the whole, especially successful societies, don't expend huge amounts of energies into things that aren't useful for them. And of course, different societies define useful as very different things. The Romans clearly thought that spectacles were not just a way to sort of appease the gods, but they were a way for the people of Rome to connect. And it's hard to deny that because, the Circus Maximus, as I said, could seat 250,000. Another 250,000 could watch from the surrounding hills. So that's 500,000 in, a city that's probably like a third of the population at its height. So, if you think about that, there's nothing that we could do as a people. That's admittedly only Rome, but there's nothing we can do as a group that brings us together in that way on a consistent basis. And if you go around the arenas, like if you go around, say, you go down to Pompeii and look at their arena, which I think sat 19,000 people, pretty much the entire town's population, you could get your entire population in there and sort of somehow, do the things that you needed to do as a group, to either unify yourself or in some cases to show that you were punishing the right people, in other places to show that you were spending your money on the people. And the other thing is that because they could seat so many people, they served as excellent ways to sort of distribute food and other things like that. So there were grain distributions that were set up all around Rome. But, you could get gifts at the they would throw tokens in the seats, and you might win a tiger. You might win an apartment building. You might win a loaf of bread. Literally people won tigers. I don't know what they did with the tigers. Like, I feel like that's probably a gift that you ask for the monetary value of.
Yeah.
It's not a very practical gift, is it? I would love a tiger, but I think I would say, no, I'll have the money.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I can't imagine what the reaction of family members would be. It's like, hey guys, guess what I got?
Sleeping on your bed.
All right, folks, we're moving. It's the tiger's house now.
Yeah, pretty much. So I don't know, but you could win like stupendous things, like obviously other things like like slaves and things like this. So they were using it as ways, and in general, the other thing is the people also used it in ways, to demand things from the emperor. Mm. And it's also important to realize that it's the crowd that decides if the gladiator dies, not the emperor paying for the show. It's only if the crowd asks for it that they can kill the person. They can offer mercy, but generally speaking, if the crowd demands it,
Right.
you know,
Well, this almost seems to
it's
tie.
not the.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah. I think one of the drawbacks of me doing the stream as well is there's a little bit of a lag in terms of our dialogue. So I apologize for talking over you. But
No, no,
I
no,
think that
no. Go ahead.
that also speaks to, I think, something that you were saying in terms of just the power that people had, that it wasn't entirely just a one-way propaganda machine, but obviously, I
Mhm.
suppose in one sense it's a way that the emperor or whoever's hosting the games uh, is largely at the mercy of the crowd, because certainly if the emperor has maybe this is a bit of a fictitious example, but let's say that they have a favorite or somebody that they'd rather show mercy to, and
Mhm.
the crowd wants to see blood or just simply wants to do something counter to the
Mhm.
established authority. I have to imagine that would be an incredibly difficult decision, or not even a decision,
Mhm.
to go against the will of the crowd in that case.
Yeah, and they didn't like it. I mean, mercy, actually handing out mercy seems to have been easier, but I think if the crowd wants to give you to give mercy to somebody, you really can't. And that gladiator did get that right. Like, it isn't an option. That's what the games are for. They're there for the crowd for one moment, to be more powerful than the emperor or this really wealthy person putting on the games. So it's a really it's obviously horrible to be poor in ancient Rome, and I'm really glad that, because most of us would have been poor. I know we always like to imagine we'd have been sort of heroic gladiators or wealthy people, but no, we'd have been sort of like in the salt mines or sort of digging ditches or something. But yeah, so I mean, so it's definitely a two-way sort of relationship between the emperor and the crowd, that has to be managed very well.
Okay.
So.
I'll actually, I just wanted to say something here. I've held back from mentioning this just because all this material is so fascinating, but there have been some comments that have been offered in the chat. X Reclamation has just said, this stream is more educational than any school class that I've had. And then there's a general agreement. So certainly I'm glad I'm not the only one getting something out of this. And I'd promised chat to let you know that I'd say that. So
Okay,
not
well, I'm glad to hear. I don't know what you want me to talk about sort of more, but actually, just before sort of we wrap up, I don't know if I mean, female gladiators always seem to be a thing that sort of interests people. So, because they are unusual, and there don't seem to have been female charioteers that we know of. But there were female gladiators, and that's like and that's where Hollywood is not inventing things. We know this because we have inscriptions. I mean, we have an inscription sort of two women in Halicarnassus, which is in modern Turkey, and it just says both of their names, Amazonia and Achillea. So the Amazon and sort of the other one named after Achilles, and it says they were sent away stantes missiones. So basically they fought to a draw, so nobody won the bout.
okay,
So if people go on for too long, you just call a draw.
right.
So, so,
Now,
so this is the. Sorry.
I was just thinking, that actually seems a little bit different in terms of how some sport is done today, where there's sort of the referee might make a judgment based on, performance during the match or something like that. In this case here, it would just be a win-lose, and any other situation after too much time would always be a draw, something like that.
It seems to be. I mean, again, we're not really sure of the rules, and we know that people didn't enjoy it because it was quite boring. So, because it was like, basically, because basically what you were doing was watching two guys bash each other, or two women bash each other around, for 20 minutes without anybody getting an obvious advantage. But basically, if you're both too tired to like deal the last blow, after a certain point, you're just not gonna. Nothing's gonna happen.
Hmm.
After 20 minutes, you just got two exhausted people staggering around.
Right.
Because they're in
No, and
armor too. You've got to remember that. So they're wearing heavy armor, and it's like if you think about the Colosseum in the middle of July, sort of.
yeah, that is not a recipe for an extended bout.
No, it's not. And also, like, I mean, it just wouldn't be very interesting. I mean, like, I guess you could just keep going, but yeah, the diminishing returns until somebody had a heart attack. I guess I'm always thinking about that Life of Brian scene. I don't know if you've seen Life of Brian, but
Oh yes, yeah.
there's the scene of the arena where the guy just runs away from the gladiator, and so the gladiator has a heart attack.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about that.
That was actually the very
So,
scene I was thinking of when you mentioned that. I'm glad I wasn't the only one. So, for those
yeah,
of you
it
in
has
chat,
to be.
yeah, I'll just let anybody in chat who hasn't seen The Life of Brian. I'm pretty sure you can find that scene on a YouTube search, but give it a little less than 10 minutes because we'll be wrapping up fairly soon. Um,
Yes, that is a great scene. I love that scene. I actually, all of Brian is just definitely, you should just, your people should just go out and watch it. I'm sure the whole thing is probably up on YouTube as well. Sort of.
I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
I know one of the scenes I particularly like out of it has nothing to do with ancient Rome, but just simply the stoning scene is one of my favorite John Cleese
Oh.
moments.
Or the kids go home. Because I teach
Oh,
Latin too. So you do a lot of
oh.
like that, like, no, no, accusative. And you sound depressingly like you're from the 19th century. Like I'm pretty sure whatever I'm saying in sort of the Latin classroom is not that much different from somebody like in the Victorian era. So there's that. So yes, the spectacles I might be talking about things Victorians would never talk about, but in Latin class it's all 19th century all the way.
All right. Maybe in the closing minutes, I just was curious. I think the one thing is that I had mentioned that we had talked about the idea of spectacle to start off with, and then I think I sort of railroaded you on the way to talking about gladiators a lot. I guess could we maybe talk a little bit about what some other ideas of, what else would be kind of classified under Roman spectacle? I sort of know about the triumph seems to be something that comes up quite a bit in any of the reading that I've done, but that's really the only other thing I know about.
Well, you have to learn about the great mime riots of Rome then, because absolutely stupendously, I think if you were to go on the sort of chain of like sort of premier, like sort of with sort of chariot racing being the top, they would share that top ranking with mime actors. Now, I know everybody is probably thinking, what the hell? But it's more like Cirque du Soleil. It's a sort
Okay.
of ballet, sort of acrobatic thing with singing and a full orchestra. And apparently it was incredibly, incredibly sexy. Like people would have orgasms watching it. so, so, so I hope that's not too sort of risque for sort of any of the younger sort of group. But so basically it was this amazing thing. And one year, they tried to pay the mime artists less. And I know everyone thinks like sort of, yeah, so try and not think about like sort of French, the traditional hilarious French mime. And
Right.
the mime artists refused to come out and perform. Like they were like, no, we don't show up for this. And they had these huge fan clubs. And basically they rioted until the Roman government had to back down and pay them. And then 2 years later, they did it all again.
That's, I mean, easily enough, that is probably the best story that I've gotten out of the stream today. I mean, I didn't know about Roman miming in the first place,
Yeah.
and after such a glowing recommendation, I don't care about the younger members of the audience. I need to learn more about this.
So,
But the mime
yeah.
rights is wonderful.
I mean, I've always wished that somebody would have a band called the Great Mime Riots because it's the most perfect. If I had sort of music talent at all, I would form that band just to call ourselves the Great Mime Riots because I just like, whenever you say it, people always visualize, sort of thousands of mimes fighting in the street. But no, what it is, it's like, I guess, like sort of a cross of like a pop star athlete and, I don't know, an actor all in one with these immense fan clubs, which included senators and equestrians. People would have them come over to their houses. Caligula used to sort of like to sort of kiss one sort of in the public sort of while watching games, except I think that might have been the one he also killed later. So yes. So yes, and they were very, very popular, and you couldn't really throw them out because every time they tried throwing them out, people just rioted more. So
I was going to say that's nothing. I remember in Vancouver, I have a couple of friends in the film industry, and I know the writers' strike certainly did not solicit that kind of a response. I think our unions need to get a little bit more classics in their playbook.
I think so. I think you just need to harness that star power some way. Like, no, you need to like factions. But yeah, the factions amongst the mimes was like definitely a huge problem for them. And eventually they got taken into the same sort of faction system as the charioteers. So you could be a blue and support a blue mime, and also want to be a charioteer and be in your blue fire brigade. So
uh,
yes, so everything in the end always comes back to the factions.
yeah, that's so interesting because I can't say that I've read a lot about this. It's a subject that I'm interested in, but I think it really seems to be that this idea of spectacle seems to be this tremendous organizing force. It's like it's very clearly more than just entertainment, and it's something that seems to be incredibly underappreciated about this subject.
I think it is. I mean, I think that we would tend to be shocked if we knew, like, probably how much of the Roman sort of economy was diverted towards this. Because the other thing is that it follows, like, it's not just the cost; it's the cost of, say, shipping animals, exotic animals in from everywhere, which is an enormous expense that the emperor or sort of somebody like takes upon themselves. So these animals have to come through, so they have to have networks. So there's part of the army whose job it is just to catch animals. So it becomes,
Right.
it's entwined in absolutely everything that they do, partially because, as I said, it's the way that you see the emperor. Like, when else are you going to see the emperor? You're never going to see the emperor unless you
Right.
see him, at the Colosseum. So, and he's giving you this enormous 100-day spectacle at which you could win a tiger that will probably kill your family, but you still have a tiger.
Uh,
So, it could work out more space. I mean, I guess going back to the tiger, whether or not you took the tiger depends on how much you like, say, your roommates or your family. Yeah.
I was gonna say
So
very
yeah,
very practical. All right. Um,
so really, I mean, it's a huge part of their world.
yeah. And I was going to say that's I think that does a very wonderful job of sort of bringing us back to
Mm-hmm.
the introduction that you gave us in terms of how the world was organized and sort of that transition from the republic to the empire, and certainly giving us an idea of just giving us a bit of an idea in terms of uh, sorry, I just got your message. I completely lost my train of thought on that. I think I should apologize to anybody in
Oh,
chat.
sorry.
I think we've run out of time for questions, so I don't intend to take any more that you had on there. But
Okay.
I do think that was a wonderful point that you had that you closed on that really tied us back to the original point. If I may just take one more minute of your time, I guess the one thing that I would
Mm-hmm.
hope to ask of any of the guests on the show is you've given us a lot to think about, and clearly the response was very positive from chat. And so, on their behalf, I'd like to thank you for coming in. But maybe as a
Yeah, thank
closing
you.
point, if somebody was interested in pursuing this topic, other than, of course, enrolling in UBC and going to the classes, I've got your website, which I'll be bringing up on the screen, and of course, with the caveat that you gave me that it's currently being moved, and so it's not quite in the state of completion that you probably want us to be looking at it at. But I'll put it up anyway, just because I think it's certainly something that I think people would love to see. But if somebody is more interested in following up on these topics, what would you suggest in terms of in terms of further reading or some resources that people can check out to do some work on their own account?
Mm-hmm. So, first of all, because I use open source textbooks, there's a couple of readers up on my site. So if you're looking for primary sources, there's one with a lot of primary sources up on it. I'm not putting it up because I make any money out of it or anything else. It's just I have them for my class. So if you go under the source books, if you're just interested in the primary sources and some of the stories that I've told, you can go through that. It's pretty, it's not, there's notes and everything else. But I want to recommend one particular book, and if you ever get the chance to hear him speak, I'm not just saying this because he's a fellow Irish person, but it's a guy named, sorry, but he's amazing. It's a book called The Lure of the Arena. And
Okay.
the subtitle might put some people off. It's social psychology in the crowd at the Roman Games, but it's not. It's what it is. It's a little bit, it's basically, he tries to talk about why, first of all, the Romans really like this. And he talks a lot about the crowd and why do, how do people communicate, what's trying to go on. And it's a lot about like modern understanding of like violence or group thinking or how, we can all fixate on one thing. So it's a really, really nice, it's not necessarily an introduction to the games, but in sort of thinking about how the audiences worked at the games, and sort of stuff like that. It's a great book, I mean, and it's just a really interesting read. So there's that, and that's a couple of years old, I think. If anybody is interested in the Roman triumph, Mary Beard, if you watch the History Channel and see a classicist, it's probably Mary Beard, has a book on the Roman triumph. That's a lot of fun to read. I mean, as you would imagine if you've ever seen Mary Beard speak. So those are like, and there's so many things. I mean, the more they're going to promise you on the cover, probably the less true they are. But, there's a value in that. Like, there's a value in reading completely entertaining stuff. I buy this stuff all the time, even though it's terrible. Even though it's like that terrible book about the woman gladiator in England that turned out to be, well, they'd lost the pelvis. So they didn't really know if it was a woman or not. So I think you buy the things that you like. I think the primary sources, though, are all available online. So if you're interested in reading, say, about the life of Caligula, and the games, those can all be easily accessed. There's a great website called Lacus Curtius, which I think is linked quite a few times from my website, which just has all these ancient sources, which are half the time way more entertaining than you could possibly imagine. If you have to read anything, you can read the Historia Augusta, which is this late source, which is completely makes up stuff all over the place. But it also covers Commodus. And it tells us hilarious stories about how he came to be born a crazy gladiator fan. You can't believe it. Also covers Elagabalus, who will just blow your mind about Rome. So definitely sort of that sort of stuff. And then you've got Suetonius's lives, which are hilariously entertaining. So I think really you can't go worse than just to read the ancient stuff. It's fun, it's half the times way more shocking. Like you read stuff, I read through these lives all the time. I'm like, God, how did I miss that? Like I can't remember what I was reading. It was something about some people who did. It was like, I'll just leave you on this note because this will probably make you read the ancient lives more. I was reading one of the lives of Suetonius, one of the emperors. Was it? I think it was that. And they were talking about expelling these groups of performers, and what their performances were was they would have group sex at parties. So I was like, what? It was all fun and games in ancient. Well, probably not, but there you go. So on that note, now I have encouraged you to read ancient literature for whatever horrors it can tell you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't think we can top that. So I will say, for those of you who tuned in partway through, this was Professor McElduff from the UBC Department of Classical Near Eastern Religious Studies.